Hello, survivors, and welcome to First Aid Spray, a Resident Evil podcast by fans for fans. This is a very special, non-numbered bonus episode of the show. We previously discussed in great detail, something like 4.5 hours worth, our reaction to Netflix's Resident Evil show, the good, the bad, everything in between. With the show's recent cancellation, we are joined by a very special guest to talk about the behind the scenes of the show and do a little bit of a post-mortem. My name is Cy, and joining me for this discussion, we have Kelsey, aka Mr. KDB.
Hello.
It's Moist Owlet, aka James.
Hello.
And our very, very special guest, the visual effects supervisor on Netflix's Resident Evil adaptation, Kevin Lingenfelser.
Hello, everyone. Good to be here.
It's good to have you. Thank you for putting some time aside. I know it can be tricky with time differences as well, so we are working with 8 hours of difference right now, but we appreciate you being here, Kevin. First of all, how's it going?
Good.
Excellent. So we're going to sort of bounce around a bit. Obviously, the cancellation of the show came out within the last couple of weeks. It's been an interesting time on social media, to say the least. We'll certainly get to that, but we wanted to sort of go right back to the beginning and sort of get to know you a little bit better and your history in terms of work and with Resident Evil. So I guess the most obvious place to start is, how did you get your start working in visual effects?
Boy, yeah. Let's see. January of next year, I will have been doing this for 30 years now.
Damn.
Wow. Started in 1993. I was born and raised in Michigan, but I've been, geek at heart kind of thing. Grew up, saw Star Wars in the theater, and saw, a lot of films that kind of jumpstart people's passion for visual effects. Early on. I grew up at that time. I was 6 years old when I saw Star Wars. So I kind of knew I was very, very interested in that. In visual effects, or just just in general, how was this kind of thing achieved? How was it done? And further cemented that kind of took things in a whole same trajectory, but I was more interested in that kind of horror aspect of that, and and how grounded that film was, how truly unique and how believable it was. And so did the whole high school, but when it came to going to a college or anything like that, and then I decided, no. I was also really heavy into comics at the time, so I knew of a school of all places, Dover, New Jersey, headed by this very, very famous comic book artist, Joe Kubert, he's got 2 sons now. Adam, very famous comic book artist. Joe's passed on, but he had a school, in Dover, and it was called the Joe Kubert School of Cartoon and Graphic Art. And so I decided to apply. They accept like 300 people a year, so I got in. I did that from like 89 to 91. I graduated high school in 88. And then they had like a small computer animation shop, and it was all Mac 2Es or whatever, 2Cs, whatever they were. Very rudimentary, animation software. I can't even remember what it was called. But they also had the classics. The teachers were all either working artists or retired. Like the letter, artist teacher that I had, was the guy who created Dondi, this very famous comic back in the day. And then I learned figure drawing from one of the greats, former student of a wonderful artist named Bern Hogarth, very famous. And we had a down shooter for animation, so we actually would do animation cells, and we would actually shoot them as part of our process. So did that, like I said, for 3 years. Came back home to Michigan, and then about a year later, I'd found like a possible connection at ILM, and this guy named Ed Jones, and he was leaving ILM to start a company in Hollywood, because ILM at the time was up in San Rafael. And so he was starting this company with Kodak called Cinesight, And the first thing they were going to do was this restoration of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because it was a hot mess basically, full of scratches, dirt. When they were
Yeah.
shooting the cells, there's a sheet of glass that goes on top of the cell to hold it in place and shoot. And those things can be, if not careful, they're just like dust magnets. So basically, we started doing that at Cinesite, and it was a frame by frame, and it was done at 4K. So I think the resolution at the time was like 4096 by 2048 pixels. It was
Wow.
painful, to say the least.
Yeah.
Very, very tedious, very slow process. You would basically go by quadrants, 4 quadrants or even 8s, and just go through. We even had to remove the, back when film was prolific, they would have a reel change, and the reel change was noted by like a blip in the upper right corner, and it was this round shape,
Oh, yeah.
And we had to get rid of that as well, because we were working from, combination of negatives and prints. So did that, and that's all Cinesite was supposed to be. But Ed, in his kind of like infinite wisdom, decided, no, let's do some visual effects. So we started very, very slowly, because the place didn't have a rep yet for that. So we started with wire removals, simple kind of things. And so the very first film I worked on, my very first film credit, was the 1993 film called Demolition Man.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
It's in the credit list there. So I did a lot of the wire removals for the fight sequences and stuff like that, and we did some eyeball scanning type stuff, and we also helped with when Wesley Snipes' character was frozen at the end of the film. And we had to do a whole international thing where, if you remember the film, there's a whole thing with the product placement with Taco Bell, and so for the international release, we had to go and change that to, or was it the other way around? I can't remember if it was Pizza Hut or Taco Bell.
I can imagine it got changed to Pizza Hut. I would guess a bigger international presence than Taco Bell,
yeah,
that's
so
crazy.
So we had to do a bunch of these shots with the logo on it, change all that stuff, and then from there it kind of bloomed. I worked on True Lies, doing some hardcore, just wild stuff they would never do now, where there was a shot, and that was one of those films. It's like, to this day I still go through this, where we see a lot of times the films out of context as visual effects artists. We don't get to see the whole thing, and True Lies was one of those films. As shots were coming in, I was just like, oh my god, this movie's going to be the biggest piece of shit. Like there were these shots with the horse when he jumps from the building to the other building, and the horse stops and he flies off. So there was like a wire on the horse that had to be removed. There was a scene where on the bridge, the infamous bridge, that was a combination of miniatures and location shooting in the third act, where the bridge is severed. It's been blown in half, and one of the bad guys, he pumps the brakes, and he's teetering on the edge, and this pelican lands on the roof of the van or whatever. That thing had like 8 wires on it. And they went all over the dude's face. And so this was at a time where whenever you did wire removals, it was kind of like the Snow White thing, where it was a frame by frame, tedious process. Procedural methods weren't really in place yet. And what I mean by that is, even with automated methods, you still have to have an artist behind it. But now there's an infinitely, there's a lot more software that can handle things like that. Back then, it was all done frame by frame. So did that, and started experimenting with compositing. So I was at Cinesite for like 10 years, and I worked on stuff like Waterworld, Air Force One, Armageddon, Truman Show. The last 2 films I did there were Envy, a little known film. It was a packed cast, directed by Barry Levinson, starring Jack Black, and oh my god, I'm forgetting his name. God, it had Christopher Walken in it, Rachel Weisz, the main guy. Oh, Stiller. My god, Ben Stiller. And did that. I even I would travel sometimes. Like I did like an 8-week stint in Cinesite London when they opened that facility after us, so I could work on the Lost in Space film that was being done over there. So did some shots for that as well.
The one with Matt LeBlanc.
Yeah, with Joey.
Yes. But luckily I did. I thought it was a pretty cool sequence at the time. I did the sequence where Gary Oldman's character, professor, was in a hologram room. Didn't know it at the time. It was in the middle of the desert, so we shot all these plates, and then it turned out to be that it was a hologram. So I did that sequence. I didn't work on any Matt LeBlanc stuff or any of that up looking monkey.
I was just about to ask.
That poor thing went through puppet, it went through CG. Oh my god. Anyways, so did that. I was there for 10 years. Like I said, they shuttered Cinesite Hollywood in 2003, and then, so from there I kind of shifted over to Digital Domain and in Venice, California, and that's where my eyes were really opened. So I started working on iRobot was the first big one, and that was a huge one. A lot of shots in that film. We did all the NS5s, as they were called, and very elaborate stuff, motion capture and whatnot, facial animation. So worked with on and off with them for a while. Worked on the third Pirates movie, the Pirates of the Caribbean. Which one was that? Dead Man's Chest. I get them confused now. Yeah, thank you. And I did the sequence where Commodore Beckett and his ship are nuked, and he's coming down the stairs as his ship is just ripped apart and was shot.
Yeah,
that's the sequence I did. We were up for an award for that sequence, matter of fact.
It's kind of memed to this day as well, which is fun to see. You see it.
Yeah, it's a GIF, isn't it? Yeah.
It's immortalized, definitely.
Yeah. So that was a cool thing. And then my brother had opened up a studio at the same time, so I helped him out periodically. I'd bounce back and forth between DD and Furious Effects. And then the last thing I did 10 months in Vancouver with them on a movie called Jack the Giant Slayer, which no one saw. Bryan Singer film, Giants. Gnarly stuff, though. I mean, a lot of great shots in it, but it wasn't marketed well, and it wasn't, received well. After that, I went into Ender's Game, and that was the last thing I did at DD. And then I switched over to episodic, and that's what got me into, doing. At first, it was broadcast show. Marvel at the time had this thing called Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., so I did that on and off for about 7 years. We were nominated for 2 Emmys during that period, which was hardcore for a broadcast show because all our competition was, cable. Streaming hadn't quite kicked off then, but I also worked on stuff like American Horror Story.
Nice.
I did 3 seasons of Preacher. I did the first 3 seasons of Preacher, and I was the production side supervisor and the overall supervisor. That was a fun show, but that was one. It's funny because there's a lot of similarities between Preacher and this iteration of Resident Evil where, Preacher, I thought, they're going to do an adaptation because that's what everybody talked about was just like, let's do, panel for panel. At one point it was going to be a movie, so obviously it wouldn't have been that.
Yeah.
But I always knew it needed to be a series. And then I got the scripts and it's like, okay, all right, I don't quite understand what's going on, but I love the property so much. I was like, okay, it, And I still, man, that pilot that we did, I still love that pilot episode, how the 3 characters were introduced. The visual effects we did for it were great. The first season is still my favorite season. Second season, it faltered. We did some good stuff. Our work was consistent, but the story just got kind of wild. And then third season was good as well because we got to do Hell.
Yeah.
Saint of Killers. I enjoyed bringing to life, and I got to meet. I still have the picture from the pilot episode. I got to meet Garth Ennis, and I got to meet and talk with Steve Dillon before he passed, the artist on Preacher. So those were highlights of my career in working on that show. And then it just got to a point where on that show I was I can't think of a better way to say it, but I was the guy. I'm not talking about ego
Yeah.
here. It's just the buck just stopped with me, visual effects wise.
Yeah.
And prior to that, I had been working with people, and I didn't have, and this is really no one's fault necessarily, but I didn't really have a mentor per speak. I didn't have anyone supervisor that I felt, okay, this is the guy I want to emulate. What I ended up learning for my career more than anything, and it was just as valuable, was okay, this is what you don't do as a VFX supervisor. This is what you don't do as you're working on a show. And that honestly, that kind of knowledge is invaluable because it helped me. I knew as I was doing other shows, okay, this is what we do, this is what we don't do. It gets very political in terms of how you have to navigate your interactions with the EPs and everybody a part of the every HOD, head of department, that you're working with, wardrobe, special effects, makeup, you name it, locations, whatever. So after about 6-7 years there, I was like, all right, you know what? I just want to work for a production. I want to just go for it. I'm getting to a point where I just want to be the one calling the shots. So I found out Netflix was doing this series. All I knew was Netflix was doing a Resident Evil series. That was it. I'm like, okay, fine. So I started. I had a name, a guy by the name of Jason Sperling. And Netflix, the way they work is they have these things called visual effects managers, and each manager gets a show or multiple shows to manage, and they're responsible for shepherding it through. And they can basically, they don't hire the supervisors. What they do is they get the names, the supervisors, they get a pool of supervisors in, and then they go to the EPs and say, hey guys, here's your list. And then you're interviewed and so forth. And so I went through that vetting process. I interviewed with Andrew. Him and I hit it off. He expressed to me that he was a fan of the series. He seemed to know more than I would have thought, honestly, about the series. And then so he was interested in finding out, okay, where I was coming from, where my interests lie, what I wanted to do. He gave me examples of the type of creatures that were going to be in the show. I'm like, okay, I'm fine, I'm in. I was like, you know what? I didn't care at that point. I was just like, let me just do this and let me bring the best version of these creatures to the screen as possible, because I'd grown up playing the games. I played the first game in '96, I'm when I got my first, PlayStation. So when the first game came, I played it, played all the other ones. I've seen all of Anderson's films. I've gone to the theater and seen them, and I enjoy them for what they are.
Mm-hmm.
I saw Welcome to Raccoon City while we were working on our show.
How was that? Like, just interesting, because obviously there was a lot of talk in the fandom how so much stuff was being made at the same time. You were working on it. Was there competition, or was it more just, how did you see the movie in comparison?
It was weird because, both things were shepherded by Constantine. Constantine still has those rights to the name and the series and or whatever films. So it was weird. And I mean, personally for me, I'm not an EP or whatever, but there's no way in hell I would have done that, because when it first started, there was nothing but confusion.
Yeah.
And so while we were shooting, and people were posting pictures from where was it? Where did they shoot? Toronto or Montreal? I forget where they shot the movie. Anyways, people thought that was the Netflix show. People would say, "Hey," and it's like, "Oh, Jesus Christ, no, that's not us." And
I remember actually when we were covering on the news, because obviously we were getting sort of drip feds of information, and obviously it was little bits of leaks and stuff. We had to clarify several times to lots of different people because they couldn't, didn't know what was heads and what was tails of what, and we had to kind of keep track of what it was and tell people, oh no, this is one thing, this is the other. It was really a strange time.
Yeah, it was, and what Constantine should have done, and I'm not trying to point fingers here, but what they really should have done is they really should have said, hey, welcome to Raccoon City. And that was the other thing. It took them a while to even find a name. They didn't have that name, actually. So they should have been clear and said, hey, this movie we're doing, that's an adaptation. That is literally Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 2. like it or not, we're taking those two stories and kind of smashing them together and making this. And that one was supposed to be touted. This is for the fans. This is for the fans. And then what they should have done with ours is they should have been very clear about it and said that this is not an adaptation. What this is kind of, think of this as another story. I think, honestly, once again, hindsight, I don't know to what extent Constantine will do a post-mortem on it. I get why they involved the Wesker name and stuff like that, but maybe hindsight, they would have been best served to not go that route. Even Lance, killed it and probably brought the best version of that character to life, in my opinion. You know what I mean? He gave him some humanity. Before that, he was just kind of like a Ken doll with sunglasses.
Yeah.
I've never been a Wesker fan, man. He's a cheeseball. My friend. It's just how I feel.
No, I'm with you completely.
Yeah.
It's like, so when people, got into the whole race swapping thing and just the idiocy that started, I knew we were in trouble. I knew, and then they posted the infamous, CW photo of the cast, and I knew, all right, here's another nail in the coffin. This is going to be fun. Because I knew at that point, I know what those poor cast members went through on the film.
Yeah.
I knew the racists were going to come out in droves, and they did. They did not disappoint. They couldn't stand the fact that the show was it was very diverse, people of color, and then it was a primarily female cast too, and there was some griping about that as well, but that kind of died down more than anything else. So I kind of knew my producer who he has a younger son and he doesn't play video games. I play video games. I have like an Xbox, I have an S and an X, and I have a PS5. And I played Village while I was working on the show in South Africa. That's where I got my Xbox Series S. I couldn't get an X at the time, so I got that and just digitally downloaded it and played it while we were, in between shoot days and just downtime whenever I could.
Nice.
But I kind of warned him. I said, look, man, just so you know, this is going to be a hard sell. There's going to be fans out there that just aren't going to be into this. This is very different. When I read these scripts, and like I said, I blame Netflix. I blame Constantine. It's like, you guys should have been clear about what it was. This was, the word adaptation should not have been thrown around. That's not what this is. This is kind of like almost like a alternate parallel universe kind of thing.
Exactly.
It's its own thing. I will stand behind the merits of almost every aspect of the show in terms of, when I read stuff about the acting being bad, I don't get at all. I don't see that at all. Everybody in it I thought was great. It's just a matter of preference, because a lot of people liked Palola's performance, and then a lot of people thought she was just chewing scenery too much. So that's a matter of preference and taste and whatnot, things like that.
I was a fan.
But I don't think anybody was. What was that?
I was a fan.
Same.
Yeah, a lot of people were, and she's great.
Yep.
I didn't have a lot of personal time with her.
Cool.
The girls, all the girls I did, obviously, I worked the most with young Billy, probably the most, because she had the most kind of action-oriented and effects-oriented sequences. So everybody involved was great. Did 6 months of shooting there in South Africa, in Cape Town. So at the very tip of the continent. So, and this was all done during the height of COVID, stage 4, South Africa. So we were testing every other day, masking during our 12, 14-hour days. And then it was also the very first show I worked on too, where because of the locations and because of the timing of things, we did not work a Monday through Friday. It shifted. We sometimes worked, Wednesday through, Tuesday or whatever. So we would work weekends and stuff like that. And then we would have like Thursday, Friday off, that kind of thing. So a lot of interesting new developments on the series and just getting it done. So that's kind of where, my kind of history it got me to that point. Hopefully that was.
I mean, that was amazing.
That was so yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I suppose before we move into more about the show, like because you mentioned Netflix a couple of times, I'm sort of interested because they, I mean, I'm assuming maybe, but their kind of quality control generally seems to be incredibly high. So how, I know this isn't technically their show, obviously it's by Constantine, but how involved were they at all? Did they have feedback, I suppose, specifically on the VFX, because that's your area? And what was that like working with them? You know, we talked about the marketing and stuff, but as opposed to the VFX, what was that like?
The other first for me, and this is just straight up, this was another first where once we got into our groove and they were seeing the concepts and they were seeing the animation, I got very little visual effects notes. I'll be honest with you.
Yeah.
It was pretty much just like they were hands off. I could not. The only things they commented on, and it was hilarious, at least for me, were we would get notes on things like the iPad, FaceTime conversations, things like that.
Yeah.
But anything, and Netflix initially they had input on the Cerberus, and I knew they would. Because what I wanted to do with the Cerberus, and we ended up going mostly CG because we had to. Because the interesting thing about that was, and this is something me and my producer didn't expect, when we got to South Africa, we could not source any Dobermans that were either military bred or police bred that had any degree of aggro. The majority of Dobermans we had access to were domesticated Dobermans.
Yeah.
They were too good.
Yeah.
Sweet. And we had this whole scene, the way it was introduced and all the running and all the physicality of it, and it was constantly supposed to be growling and barking, and so they were trained up, but to a point, and the director I was working with, the way the show works is it was done in blocks. So it was 4 blocks, 4 directors, each director gets 2 episodes. So block 1 was done by this director who told me she had all this visual effects experience, and turned out that maybe she did, but she certainly didn't. It didn't come across that way.
Right.
Wasn't implemented.
Yeah. So I mean, for the caterpillar sequence, for example, let me back up to that. That was to her credit, she actually was the one that brought me that species of caterpillar. It's an actual real species that we based our boy off of. It's called Bromea persei, and the colors are that kind of Freddy Krueger Christmas red and green. That's all legit with the black barbs on them. But then we storyboarded the sequence out. She actually did that with someone. I'm like, great, cool. All right, you give that to me. We'll do previs. That's what we did. When we come to shoot in March of 21, and we get there in downtown Cape Town, and we go to shoot, and she decides to throw all that out and riff it.
Oh.
Right.
I had to stay there. Normally what is done, and this is something else I was trying to get away from this, on these bigger shows, what you have hierarchy-wise is you have a visual effects supervisor, then you have an on-set visual effects supervisor. That person is tasked with being just that. They are on set. They are the ones responsible for working the action out and stuff like that, because what that allows to happen is the visual effects supervisor then is freed up to have meetings for the next episode and the episode after that, things like that, go on location scouts. There's a lot involved. I couldn't do that because I didn't have an on-set supervisor. There was no one in South Africa that I could source, so I ended up being the on-set supervisor as well as the visual effects supervisor.
Wow.
So I ended up having to stay. So for those 3 days we were there at the Civic Center in Cape Town, I had to make sure that, when she would really go off the rails, I had to be the one to pull the reins and say, no, that's not happening. If you do that, you're going to balloon the budget, and it basically everything else that we have slotted for episodes 3 through 8 will not happen because you are being this short-sighted and this greedy. So there was a lot of conversations like that. Good times. And the dog was very similar. She had all these shots planned. I'm like, and the main problem with it more than anything was like, it just ended up being redundant. It's like, well, okay, how many times do you need to see the dog walking down the hall? We get it, you know what I mean? We need the dog to go from A to B. We need the dog. We know the dog is after the girls. The dog has Billy's scent. It's a focused, you know, for lack of a better term, killing machine.
Right.
We ended up, in the interest of just making sure I got what I needed, we ended up creating a second unit that all we did was we shot the plates for the dog ourselves. It was me and another gentleman, James AD, who was second unit director in AD, and him and I worked and we plotted all that out and we shot it separately with no involvement from the first unit. So that's how we got all those shots with the dog. And as a result of that, we did have several shots where, like, when the dog jumps toward the elevator, the girls get in it. That was we ended up getting this one really good dog named Diesel, who had the right build. He had the cropped tail, he had the cropped ears, so he was perfect reference. At the very least, I finally had a dog for CG reference, because that's what I was worried about. I was like, okay, you know, because I didn't want to do the CG dog. I wanted to do live dog and augment, you know, add things to the dog or take things away, you know, like show some desiccation, that type of thing. But that's something else that this show was shying away from. This was more about infection, as opposed to, nobody here or was really raising from the dead. Nothing here was reanimating. This was all about just being infected to the point of dying or what have you. So we didn't have those shots where, you know, you have holes in the zeros or things like that and you're seeing through to the background, that kind of stuff. We shot away from the Walking Dead kind of component of it.
Sloughing flesh and stuff.
Yeah. So it's about pustules, raw, exposed, flayed skin, things of that, and, you know, tumescent kind of qualities, things kind of very swollen and whatnot. So that was the one thing, honestly, we didn't, thankfully, I was worried about this, but the makeup wise was solid enough that we didn't really have any visual effects shots makeup wise that we had to go in and fix anything. So that was a relief, because we did have, while we were shooting, shots just kept adding on and on and on for time's sake. And also, we didn't have an armorer on set. So every firefight that you see in the show from episodes 1 through 8, every muzzle flash is us. Every gun firing where you're seeing shells ejecting out of the port, that is us. Every handgun that fires and you see the slide go back, that is us. Awesome. It was all just, they had 3D printed weapons for the Umbrella Troopers, but they weren't functional, you know? And these guys also, they had to mime the action of like firing a fully automatic gun, things like that. Go through, believe it or not, we had to go through iterations of that, because sometimes people took it too far and it looked comical. It was like, no. Just pump the brakes, think about it, and just, you know, don't be, you know, looking like you have Tourette's, you know, just, you know, take it easy. There was just a lot of challenges just to get the 6 months of production done. And then when we came back to LA, we had about another 6-8 months of post to finish off the visual effects. So,
is there, so you've spoken about kind of the disadvantages that like COVID gave you, etc. Like when it comes to the VFX and stuff. But is there like one or two particular VFX moments in the show that are absolutely your favorite? And I want to amend on top of this: are there moments in the show that could have been better, VFX wise, in your opinion?
Yes, I think always. I mean, I haven't worked on. I'm kind of. I consider myself an A-type personality, and I strive for perfection, or my version of perfection. There really is no such thing as perfection, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You strive for, and that was, I didn't care about anything else. I didn't care about the white noise of the internet trolls and all that. Focused on, while I was doing the show, okay, our liquor has to be the best. That's why I picked the vendors that I did for this. Interestingly enough, Constantine, they had, I don't know how familiar you guys are with this part of it, but Constantine had this long-standing relationship with a visual effects vendor named Mr. X. and it was not from Mr. X, which is a commonality. It was not created from the Mr. X that we know and love from the games. It's just, coincidence. Anyways, Mr. X had done the movies for years, done the liquors, done all variations of the liquor, done everything. I as much as I like the Paul Anderson films, the one aspect of them I did not like was the visual effects. I was like, no, we can do better than this.
You did.
You definitely did, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm not, once again, that's not ego. It's just, I knew I had to create a mark or a bar for myself, so to speak. So I knew, okay, we're going above and beyond this. And Constantine wasn't used to that. So Constantine initially was like, oh, we'll just give everything to Mr. X. I'm like, no, you're not doing that. If you want me on the show, this is what we're going to do. And I knew I wanted this company called Important Looking Pirates, this great company out of Sweden. They do wonderful work they're a very, very small company, but they've done wonderful work on the Jurassic Park films. They've done some of the best shots in the Lost in Space series. These guys are fantastic. So I knew I have this crocodile. We're giving it to ILP. All right.
What a great name as well.
Yeah. And Important Looking Pirates. And they're fantastic. I mean, they're just really sweet guys. And they're also, I ended up working with people that also kind of have the same aesthetic that I do and the same drive and the same passion for this stuff. So, and then I involved Rodeo, who I've been a big fan of, and they have a history of working on Stranger Things and stuff like that. And they worked on the original Game of Thrones series. And so Rodeo ended up being, my go-to horse. So Rodeo ended up doing the caterpillar, the Cerberus, the rat, the spider, and the lizard. The little lizard that we have at the top of episode 8.
Oh, yeah.
And then Mr. X, I was like, okay, you guys can do the liquor since you have a history with it. But the one thing you are not doing is you're not taking any of the models from the films, any of the previous models, and reusing those, repurposing those. Constantine wanted to do that because he wanted to save money.
Wow. Yeah.
I'm like, no, this is what I want. I had them concept up the liquor the way I wanted it. The supervisor at the time, this is an idea that it's in the series, but I wish we could have played it up more. I had two fundamental issues with the liquor, and I always thought the tumescent brain was just kind of jokey. It was kind of like, okay, why the does this thing have it, and why would you create such a large hitbox on this thing? I mean, it just seems kind of redonkulous, and so I didn't want to go and change the look of it. I didn't want to do anything that. I didn't want to anything. But I'm like, well, what if we do this? What if we have pieces of skull surrounding the base of the brain? So the brain, and then let's take the swollen nature of it down. Maybe this is an early gen, liquor. It isn't as far along. And then the other thing I had a problem with, and even more so in the CGI films, I'm like, are you me? Where the tongue is like 50 feet long. It's going on. I mean, I love that scene where the tyrant, takes it and twirls it around and stuff like that. But and so honestly, what ended up happening is the supervisor, and I'll always give him credit for this, David Jones, he said to me, well, in the animal kingdom, the woodpecker has the world's longest tongue. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, how's that work? And they have a long beak, but besides that, the tongue actually goes through the back of the head and wraps around the brain. And I'm like, okay, we're doing that.
Yeah.
I'm like, let's do that. So we did that. So they're in the scene where the liquor is crawling down the top of the van and has the face off with Jade. It's in there. It's hard to see because it's a dark scene. That was kind of like the other thing, getting back to your original question about what I'm most proud of. What I did really like about what we also did too is we had a lot of our bigger creatures were in broad daylight. The caterpillar was in broad daylight. There was no it was just like we knew we had to make that thing look, and that one probably was our toughest. Probably besides the dog, that was our toughest creature because Constantine early on wanted to cut the caterpillar because they had seen like our early previs where, and that's pre-visualization. Sorry if I'm not trying to, over explain things here, but basically it works with a completed model, but it isn't textured or finished. So it's usually a gratiated thing and it goes through all the motions. And so when they saw it, they're like, oh, what? This thing looks like a bird. And I'm like, guys, you realize it's not done, right? And believe me, you don't know how many times I have to have this conversation. I'm not kidding. I'm not just saying that for laughs. It's borderline nauseating. So it's like, no, just pump the brakes. Just give us the time that we need to finish it. Believe me, when it's done, you're going to love it. So that was done in broad daylight. And then, of course, the crocodile was broad freaking daylight. We had a couple underwater shots, but, and I knew, like I said, ILP was going to nail that as well. So I wasn't too worried about it. The spider and the liquor were kind of like, okay, yeah, we could do a scene with the liquors in broad daylight, but that subterranean element and the whole thing with the channel was just rife for them to be there. So it just made sense to have that environment play out for both those creatures, especially since they were within the same episode and they were one sequence finished and the other one picked up almost right away. So as far as I don't think, the creatures, I'm happy with all of them. I mean, the dog was hard because everybody knows what a dog looks like. Everybody knows what a dog moves like, even if you don't own a dog. It's just one of those commonalities. And so we knew that, okay, we've got to get this right. We've got to make sure the dog has weight. So when it leaps in the air, it doesn't look like it's, weightless, everything. And when it lands, you've got to see the muscles react to the impact, everything, especially with a Doberman, which has incredibly short hair. All you're left with is seeing all that muscle definition on the animal. So we had to make sure we nailed all that. So that took a while. But I'm very happy with the creature stuff. There was some early stuff. One of the very, very first sequences that most people wouldn't even realize was visual effects was when Jade is walking to the location in London with the bunny in the cage, and she lets it loose and pricks it and sets it down. That environment there, and once again, this was South Africa. That environment was dressed only from like the first floor down. And this is we talked about the director with. We said, okay, if we're not going to do the second floor or the third floor, dress those to be post-apocalyptic, to be degraded, properly and weathered. Then you're going to have to keep the camera, pointed more ground level. Well, sure. While I was doing second unit on the Caterpillar, she decides to aim every goddamn camera up at the sky. So we end up, and we'll have a before and after. I haven't gotten it yet, but we're going to do a before and after that sequence. So you'd have a building where ground level was completely aged and weathered, broken windows, and then everything above it was this perfectly pristine kind of beige color, pristine windows. It was ridiculous. So it was not a part of our visual effects budget either. So I'm like, okay, we're going to give that. There was a company I worked with called Mr. Wolf, and these guys came in and did that sequence, and these guys also did the majority of our muzzle flashes and gun, shell casings, all that stuff, and impact hits. We didn't have a lot of squib hits in the show either, but it was mostly us. So that was a great sequence. But then when she makes her way across Westminster Bridge, the very first shot where she's got her head down on the ground and she, the camera lifts and tilts with her and reveals the background. That one I was never 100% happy with. And I don't blame the vendor for that at all. It was just one of those shots where the very next shot is her wide back and we see Westminster. You see Big Ben in the background of Parliament and all that. That looked great, I felt. But that first shot just didn't quite have the same kind of feeling that the second shot did. and there were a couple other shots involving Brighton Freehold where the actual Zero horde that we had to do CG with as well. I just felt like that could have been better. The one thing I did like about what we did there was it was the DP's idea. Oliver Miller was the DP of that block. Adding the flare overhead, that was a nice touch. And that, of course, made that made the job harder because you had a traveling light source. That's always a good time when you're doing, any kind of visual effects. It makes things more interesting and visually more impactful, but it's definitely challenging. And then let's see what else I could think of. It's like wasn't crazy about episode 2. Pretty much was picking up dead dog. He had the introduction of the rat at the end, getting infected after Albert tested the Billy's blood on it.
Mm-hmm.
Third episode had all our good stuff in it. It had the rat fully infected. It had the liquor. It had the spider. It also had our kind of like our director wanted a nod to Resident Evil Remake where Jill's looking at herself in the mirror. There's a sequence where Billy runs, and that, oh dude, that was a nightmare because the way I would normally do that kind of shot, whenever you have a mirrored shot, is you build both sides of the set. You know what I mean? And then you put a piece of glass between them. And then, so the way I wanted to do it was the stunt person was going to be wearing the camera rig. Since you don't see the stunt person's face, didn't matter. So on the opposite side, the mirrored side, you'd have Billy, the actress, Sienna, come in, do her motions and whatnot, and then the stunt performer would sync up to her. They would be synced timing, with the hands and stuff like that. Whatever you see from the camera side, that would all sync up. That's not what ended up happening, of course. Production complained they didn't have the ability to build the other half, so we had to do it as a mirrored shot. So poor Sienna had to put on like a 20-pound, 25-pound camera rig that obliterated her entire torso.
You had to get rid of it.
Up to her, from her waist to probably the bottom of her chin.
Wow.
And so, yeah, we had to clean that up. So that was a nightmare. A company called Mars did that for me, and they did a great job. That was a tough shot. That was just one of those shots where it's like, okay, just so you know, this is going to be expensive.
I mean, I think what I would say is, I speak for the guys as well, as we all thought the digital effects were fantastic. And I think you've mentioned about your drive to get the attention to detail and stuff, and that obviously paid off because it's one of the strongest aspects of the show. But with VFX kind of being, an all-encompassing term, I don't know how much crossover you had with the practical side and practical effects and the same sort of thing, really. Is there anything in the show that you think worked really well or maybe not as well, just from your perspective?
The only really practical effects were the makeup effects of the Zeros.
Yeah.
That was, and that did work, like these Zero Queen, Candice, the actress that, wore that makeup, that was like a 6-hour makeup job for her. We didn't do any touch-ups to her whole battle with Jade and the chainsaw. That was, done digitally. We did add some blood. There was some practical blood there.
That's cool. Yeah.
We decapitated her. Obviously, that was us. And then we had a fake head. All the headshots that were done, like there's a sequence where after Jade is trapped in that in the Brotherhood bunker in that room, and she finds the grenade and she throws it and blows up, and she comes out and she's all PTSD, struggling, and she's jumped by a Zero at the end of it, and his head gets blown off by Baxter. That was digital. There was. I'm a big fan for, once again, working with practical and augmenting practical.
Yeah.
But I mean, there were other things like that most people wouldn't know. I mean, it was another sequence that it didn't turn out great, but it was because of the way it had started, the way it had been envisioned. Unfortunately, a lot of times when we did work with practical, what ended up happening is we did not see any version of that practical element until Dave's shooting,
Right.
and which is far from ideal. Then that wasn't just us. That was the director. That was everybody on set. This thing would just show up, and we'd have to take it, and which once again just so wrong. There's that sequence in episode 6 at the end where Angel is gonna, he's been killed by Wesker, and they're gonna do the autopsy. When what they have, the doctor there, Evelyn's there watching, overseeing, whatever, and the guy cuts into him with the scalpel. Well, the special effects guy brought in a chest piece that had been made with a tuft of chest hair in the area the guy was going to cut, and it also looked like, I don't know about you guys, but it's like I've never seen chest hair that it just looked like a tumbleweed glued to the prosthetic. I'm trying to be kind here.
Yeah.
So, and I'm like, and I've had surgery before, and I'm like, you guys realize whenever, even an autopsy, why would you cut through hair like that? You're gonna shave it. There should not be any hair on him.
Yeah.
So they go and do it anyways, and it doesn't work, of course. So they turn to me and like, can you fix it? I'm like, yeah, sure. It's gonna work again, no problem. 8 more shots, and just adds to the overall visual effects budget. So Mars again was the one that kind of helped us out with that, because we knew the only thing we had to do for that sequence is after he was cut, he starts convulsing, and then this rash spreads. So we knew we had to do the rash, but cleaning up the prosthetic was not a part of the deal. So, and then like I said, the whole issue with the no armor, and so there were no blanks. There were no blanks that were fired. We had what we call is, a lot of times with big visual effects productions, you'll do an element shoot day, and what that means is you'll go out to a stage or wherever you need to go, and you'll shoot things like muzzle flashes, cartridge ejections, sparks, fireballs or fire plumes or just fire elements for something, things like that. So we had 2 days of that we did, and we captured a lot of those, as many of those elements as we could, and those are usually, the nice thing about those days is those are just fun days, because it's just usually me, my producer, and the special effects guys, and they love to blow up, and we see blown up. Like one of the last days I was there, we shot this massive 3-stage fireball thing outside Cape Town Film Studios for the Crocodile. When the Crocodile was nuked, we knew, okay, let's try to get a real element for that when the missile comes down and it hits him and blows him up. But we knew we'd augment it as well as CG, and the element was great. I mean, they lit it off, and it probably went a good 100 feet in the air. The fireball, and they also packed the one of the element passes with they went to a butcher shop, so they got a lot of sheep and cow intestines, and they packed that there, and so it all gave this great texture. So I love working with those guys whenever I can, especially when it comes to blood related type things. I don't like to do CG blood unless I really, really, really have to. I like to work with the real deal as much as possible. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So with all that said, I mean, we've been talking about, especially on Twitter as well, we're talking about like potential what's coming in season 2. Potential of what's coming. I have another question for later on, but for right now, is there anything you can tell us about season 2? That could have come, because Lance Reddit mentioned there was a script and just left it there vague.
There were outlines all the way to the end and whatnot. So, I mean, I don't, at this point, I don't think, an NDA is valid, because season 2 is not happening. But in the very first script, I know it picks up Jade having been shot. She makes her way back to, she comes across the croc carcass that had been blown up, and it's being, pecked at by these ravens. And then she stumbles upon the umbrella, the HQ on the beach, and she finds Evelyn there, who's still alive. And then they are attacked by a murder of ravens, basically these infected ravens.
Cool.
Just massive amount. And Jade stumbles across the flamethrower, and so she uses that to take the flock out. And then meanwhile, while that's happening, Bert and Young in 2022, Bert's young Jade and young Billy escape, and they make it all the way. They're trying to get to, I forget which airport.
Somewhere in Japan to see Ada Wong was the cliffhanger.
Yeah, but they haven't even gotten that far. Right.
Right.
I mean, yeah, that's up. But before they even get to that point, they find their way to a reservation, and a wildlife reservation, one of the preserves out there in South Africa. I forget if it's, I'm trying to remember the name of it. Anyways, and meanwhile, Evelyn, this is once again still 2022, she has taken, and Hell, who's at this point, we saw his hand at the end, he's turned into a full-fledged tyrant. She takes him in a special containment type device and basically kind of unleashes Tyrant on Billy, trying to track down Billy. So the Tyrant has got Billy's scent. And
so they're basically pulling a lot of references from the original games then, because that's what I'm hearing.
Right.
Like Birkin and Sherry, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what I love about the fact that you mentioned the ravens and stuff is like several things that this show did that the remake games didn't give us in recent years, like the spiders and actually something worthwhile with the gator. And now we've got, kind of like the crows in this theoretical season 2. So I really appreciate all that stuff.
Yeah. So they end up tracking, I forget how they end up tracking them. But they do end up tracking them to this wildlife preserve. They release the Tyrant, and the Tyrant basically, there's several shots where you see the Tyrant running balls to the wall through preserve, through the fauna of the preserve and whatnot. And then it finally catches up to them. And in that moment, the girls and Bert, I think their vehicle is broken down, and there's an elephant that comes out of the brush. And then immediately behind that elephant is the Tyrant, who then, with the elephant in its way, rips through the elephant, rips it in half on its way to get to Billy and Jade. And they are saved by Chris Redfield at that point.
Whoa!
Yeah, so he comes in. At this point, I believe there's reference to the wolf pack, and so it's him, and he has a rocket launcher, and he uses that on the Tyrant. It does create a hole in the Tyrant. I'd have to reference the script again. So, but he's actually, yes, he is mentioned, and he was featured, and that because basically the Tyrant elephant thing, that's how the first episode ends. And then the second episode begins with that, and then that's when Chris's character is introduced in that moment. And then because there's a sequence also, I think, in that episode where after that whole thing occurs, Chris goes back with the wolf pack, and there's conversations amongst themselves and stuff, and they talk. And I believe there's a reference to Lady D in that, but it's more about like it's that moment's happened already. So
it makes sense. Like, because like we would have had Chris at this point, and if we were following the law, this would have been just after Village. So it would have made sense to have some kind of link there.
I love the fact that he's with the wolf pack. That's great.
It's dope.
Amazing.
Would have been dope.
Yes, exactly. So, and then there were other things. There was a reference to Project Neptune. I know that.
Oh
Hmm.
goodness.
There was
I mean, so this is for VFX wise for season 2. Is any of this stuff? This is obviously a job to you, but you're clearly a Resident Evil fan, which we really appreciate. But how far VFX wise had any of these plans gone for you? Had you just seen this on the page and started thinking about it and not pressed on with anything? I imagine. But was there anything else that you were kind of sad that you didn't get to realize?
Well, the first part of that is I had broken down the first script, so I knew already that it was more expensive than the first.
Yeah.
So I knew at that point, I knew, okay, we better be a hit, otherwise this isn't happening.
Yeah.
Because here's the deal: even if what I didn't want to be a part of is if the show to me had to be a hit, it had to be a runaway hit. In order to continue with the budget that we
yeah,
needed.
yeah,
Because if they had greenlit a second season
yeah.
and they came to us and they tried to do a Walking Dead and say, "Hey, we got to take money
Cheap.
away from you,"
Yeah.
I would have walked away. I would have done a Darabont. I would have said, "This, I'm not doing that. If you're not gonna, you're not going to spend the proper amount of money, the show's going to suffer." And the show, I was always telling everybody involved, that was very clear. I'm like, look, this is a visual effects show. Whether you like it or not, this is a visual effects show. There's no two buts about it. Every episode has something. 5 is about the only thing that 5 is like the one that didn't have a creature in it. That was about it. Except for we had that little sneak peek of Lisa Trevor. That was it. The eyeball. So yeah, we had that. We had this whole sequence at the Burj Khalifa where an outbreak occurs. So that was going to be massive. Tallest building in the world, and you have a Zero outbreak. Then there was the Project Neptune reference. Then there was Zero's getting run down on tarmac from a massive, like a C-10, or I forget what kind of plane it was, trying to take off. Then there was a giant infected mandrill that runs amok to San Francisco, which was this kind of King Kong, reference thing. That was a little bit later. I'm trying to remember what else.
It sounds like all of season 2 is pretty mapped out then in terms of story.
It was, yeah. It was. Yep.
So I just want to sort of track back a little bit to what you were saying about the first season, and you mentioned a lot about stuff going on where an effect was done that needed to be fixed, if you like, if that's the correct word, in post. So, therefore the visual effects budget's kind of starting to balloon.
Yes.
Do you think that the overall cost of the show when it was finally done was a contributing factor, the fact that it wasn't renewed at all?
Yeah, it always will be. It's easier for Netflix to renew a show that isn't critically liked, but the audience likes it and it's inexpensive. That's like a brainer. It's like, oh, that's done deal. That's why there's a lot of shows that you'll see get picked up.
Yeah.
But when you have a show like ours, or I'm trying to think of another recent example that suffered this kind of
the Expanse suffered from it for a bit,
yeah,
a little bit.
It's like, yeah, because department wise, we were one of the more expensive departments, but interestingly enough, we did not have the budget. I think most people would be surprised at the budget we did have and what we were able to the bang for our buck that we got, because our budget was nowhere near a Stranger Things budget, nowhere near that.
Yeah.
Not even close. The money that those guys have is a whole nother level.
Yeah.
And I get why it is, obviously, because that shows a huge moneymaker for Netflix, and this was about, getting another show. Netflix did want to see this go on. Netflix did want to have a second season, a third season, whatever it was going to, be. There was no doubt about it. But it's hard to justify it when, the numbers aren't there. Then you factor in critical response was like it didn't achieve that, critical praise. But then you had the audience audience just going in and we were reviewed bombed the holy high hell. And matter of fact, I've seen the same thing with the Lord of the Rings show.
Yeah.
That audience score on that is dismal. Not as bad as ours, but it's pretty bad.
Yeah.
But at least the critical is high. I mean, they have that going for them. So when Netflix looks at, okay, the critical's not high, the audience is like dismal. You know what I mean?
Where they're looking out of interest, because obviously, we talk about Twitter and stuff and loud people on Twitter, but are they looking at metric sites? What sort of feedback are they getting?
I think that they are, and they're looking at that, and I think for the most part, Twitter responses and stuff like that, they kind of just shrugged off that, because there was a lot of, they've been dealing with the racist stuff for a while now. And then it was apparent there was people who hadn't even watched the show. They just, wrote it off for the sake of writing it off kind of thing.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not going to be a staunch defender. The show was far from perfect. It was definitely flawed. I mean, like I said, our element of it, I have no problem. I have no qualms, no ego in saying we were the best element of the show.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
Yes.
But I also think there's performances there that were also, like I said, I love Lance. I love young girls. I loved Sienna.
Yep.
And Tamara. So, but there were issues. I knew lines like, the whole in Zootopia, but was interesting for me though is how people took one line out of context, would dump that on Twitter, and then use that as a reason for why the show sucks.
It's really stupid.
That kind of moronic stuff, I mean, believe me, there's a lot of stuff I've just let slide off of me because you kind of have to.
Yeah.
And I don't want to ever come across like I'm just, just defending the show at every turn. What I mean?
You're in good company here, Kevin.
Yeah, very much so. I think you probably saw I made a tweet a little while back that said that even if you don't like the show, there's not really any point in celebrating the show being cancelled.
That's what
because now all you're really doing is making Resident Evil that community that cheers everything that fails. And as I say, you don't have to like the show, but what you're doing is showing companies that there's no point in doing anything with the property. And so not to kick the hornet's nest again, because I got I muted the tweet immediately because I was like, oh no, what have I done? But what do you think it is about the show that really, really made some people so negative?
It's just the one thing that's constantly parroted, and it just happened yesterday, is some guy was like, oh, just, it's so simple. Just do the mansion incident. Why is it so hard? And that is like, really that. So you're going to be the 1,000th person. I mean, I get it when someone says something over and other people, but it doesn't always necessarily make it right.
No.
Or make it, it's like, look, I get why, Welcome to Raccoon City was an attempt at that, but then they shoehorned in parts of Resident Evil 2. So it wasn't just solely about the mansion. And what I find interesting is I'm reading the novels by S.D. Perry, and I'm halfway through the first one. If you're going to do the first game, use that novel as your blueprint. I'll be honest with you, the George Romero script, I was like, what the is Chris is a rancher? What? I'm like, what?
Completely different.
Yeah, but I couldn't even, and then there was the obligatory sex scene, just between him and Jill, and Jill was okay. You don't need that. And then there's just weirdness where, like for me, why they had a big component of it involving Plant 42. I'm like, really? You're gonna do Audrey from Little
Shavaris.
No, that I was amazed at like how kind of bland it was, and I was like, wow. And I know I'd read the history of it and how they had problems because with the rating of it, like Robert Kolzer of Constantine has been involved since the very first film, and he was involved all the way through this one as well. He was actually the guy that first said, "Oh, the caterpillar looks like a turd. We need to cut it." And I'm like, "Oh." And what's funny is once I kind of proved that, I never heard from Robert again. He just he stopped, because part of our process, just to back up a little bit, was as a supervisor, I talked to every visual effects supervisor at a facility, whether it be ILP, Rodeo, Mr. Wolf, Mars, whoever it is, and say, okay, this is what we're doing. And as versions start coming in, comps, composites, and stuff like that, I review them, I go over them, I give notes. I'm like, this is working great. Let's do more of this. Okay, this isn't working so much. Let's try this. I also totally instill in this idea of like, hey, I'm not going to have all the answers. If you guys have an idea you want to try, show it to me, throw it out there, and I'm all open to it. That's how we got to the liquor tongue, that kind of thing. I'm very, very invested in that kind of thing. I don't ever believe that my vision, my ideas are it. I want to work with people that make my ideas and just the idea in general better. So, I've been reading this first book, and I'm like, okay, she had an opportunity to use the line, oh, here you go. Barry's giving her the lockpicks and stuff, and I'm waiting. I'm like, oh my God, she's gonna throw in the line. She's gonna have Barry say, hey, here you go, Jill, you're the master of unlocking. But she didn't. You know what I mean? She created like this natural discourse, you know what I mean? So the dialogue is not campy. Wesker's not coming off like a robot, or like there's a thought process behind it. I'm like, geez, no one has mentioned to me that, though. Interestingly enough, out of all the people who've bitched, it's always been, oh, just make it like the first game, just do the first game, And it's like, it's not that easy, and you wouldn't. No self-respecting writer is going to just take the dialogue from that first game or the remake game into a script and expect someone to finance it. It's it's just not going to happen.
Yep.
That's why it's going to be real interesting. I'll tell you right now. What's going to be real interesting is when The Last of Us drops and people say, see, this is how you adapt a video game. This is what Resident Evil should do. My response to that will be this. Yeah, you don't want to know why? Because The Last of Us was written really well. The game itself, that story was mint. You know what I mean? It's one of my favorite games of all time, that first game. Don't get me started on Last of Us Part 2. I'm not going to get into it. But I absolutely adore the first game. I've played it many, many times. I have not dropped the 70 bones to get the remake. I'm going to wait until that comes down. But anyways, I digress. But I adore that game. And also, I think with The Last of Us, I there's no doubt in my mind when that thing drops, that will be the video game adaptation to beat all video game adaptations, because HBO did approach it smartly. HBO did say, okay, I don't know if you needed to involve Druckmann, but whatever. The fact that they hired Craig Mazin to write the script, that was more than enough. It's like, okay, he's going to work. It's a retelling of the original story. Yeah. That's great. And I don't, and then they cast it really well, you know what I mean? So it's like, but that you can't, I know people are going to do it. And it's like, that's Resident Evil and Last of Us are apples and oranges, man. You know, really they couldn't be more different, you know. One of them is incredibly grounded. You could do a grounded Resident Evil movie or series, but then you still get those detractors saying, this isn't my Resident Evil. This isn't
right. I think if you were to make it so grounded, it loses the heart, doesn't it? Like, you know, speaking as all of us here as Resident Evil fans, some of what makes it great is the fact that it is ridiculous, and you have giant plants and you have giant sharks and all these things. And obviously that's reflected in the Netflix show in different ways, but it is in there, and that's part of Resident Evil.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right. You can't make a super serious Resident Evil film because you'll have the same reaction of, oh, you're missing all this stuff. And I guess I don't know. Maybe it's a concern to have from certain people. Obviously, have way different perspectives on it, way across the board. Is there a concern maybe that Resident? You talk about Last of Us being adapted truly, which is great, and let's hope so. But is Resident Evil, in the eyes of a lot of in Constantine films, as obviously most importantly, is it just the Umbrella logo and a bunch of names? Do you think at this point?
I mean, I will. In thinking about it, having gone through this whole process, almost 2 years on this, having gone through it all, I do think the IP would be best served if you're going to go down this road again. Involve a different production company.
Yeah.
I think it is time. Okay, you've done the movies. You've done an attempt with the TV series, and you've got the CGI movies, which are done on their own or whatever. So you have all this content. I mean, Resident Evil is out of any video game, the content that has been sprung forth of it has just been staggering. And that's why, to your point, that the people that celebrated the demise of the show just kind of blew me away, because it's like, okay, when you do that, you realize you're propagating the idea that, okay, let's not do any more of this. And you're gonna have failed attempts. The problem with Resident Evil is, yes, I get those people, those legitimate people, probably like you guys are, all these legitimate people who feel like, man, time and time again, it just isn't done. It isn't done right. These things don't have the heart and soul of Resident Evil. And it is a hard thing to do, with this game. I'm not saying necessarily The Last of Us is easier to adapt, but when you're already starting with a strong foundation, you're starting with characters that are well developed, you're starting with a story and a script, you know what I mean? That goes a long way. But then when you go back to Resident Evil 1, and that's why it cracks me up when people say it's simple. It's like, it's not, man, because I'm telling you right now, if you wanted to do a straight movie of the game, the first two games are just the first game, you would have to get a writer in there who could punch it up and be like, okay, what do we do here? What do we do? What are these characters' motivations? How can we tell a proper backstory? And that's what I was liking about reading that book by S.D. Perry. I'm like, okay, she's doing this, like giving Jill the backstory that her dad was this famous thief or whatever, and so she has that kind of those genes in her. So she was able to rationalize, okay, this is why she's adept at picking locks or whatever, without saying, oh, you're the master of unlocking.
Do you think that it could be put into a novel, season 2 or 3 or 4, or a comic book or something, like a Kickstarter or something like that?
I think a comic book would be a good way to go. Yeah. Because I think you could do it. I mean, I'm trying to remember what else was thought of for season 2. They had the character arcs all plotted. I think at 1.2, don't quote me, I think at one point, which would have been probably the more interesting and fascinating thing that I regret that I won't be able to do, was there was going to be I believe there's a bit where Bert turns into a liquor, and we were going to actually see it happen.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, we were going to see him, the skin and everything, and just the whole degradation to a liquor form. Apparently that was something that Andrew had worked out.
I can tell you now, obviously the continuation of the story people are interested in, because people want to know what happens to Bert. Yeah. You've just broken so many hearts.
Yeah. I know. Yeah, he ended up being, that was another one. It was like, some people, I think generally though, a lot of people did like that character. I didn't know what to make. It was funny because I thought for sure, okay, I'm like, oh boy, this whole Olive Garden breadstick thing, this is really
right.
Ruffle some feathers. And then probably the one scene that ruffled the most, and I'm like, really? Was the whole Dua Lipa thing with
dancing.
Yeah.
And as you say, that was one of those things that was taken out of context and pointed at unfairly.
That was just Billy having fun with her and just showing off mind control. That's all that was.
Yeah.
And I mean, people thought, oh, it's just wow, this character just breaks into karaoke. It's like, no. And the other thing, I thought this was interesting too. I don't know if you guys, people were mystified by why Evelyn shoots her son as opposed to Billy after Simon's been bit. People actually, I was amazed by this. People actually had the gall of like, what the hell? Why is that's so stupid? Why is she shooting her son? I'm like, you realize Billy's a walking $1 billion, you know, could build commute. And Evelyn needed to know why. I'm like, really? That didn't come across? Apparently it didn't. I mean, there were certain things that I was like, wow, I guess it just wasn't explained well enough, you know, because that moment I thought was pretty crystal clear, but I had the benefit of being there while I was shot and reading it in advance. And, you know, so there's that kind of weird bias for me when working at a show like this is because someone else had mentioned, I don't know if it was who had told me, no, it wasn't, it was this Ben guy, I think on Twitter, who had mentioned, and I'd wondered about this too. I'm like, could the show have benefited from a weekly drop as opposed to all at once?
Yeah, interesting thought.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know? You know, would it have worked? You know, I mean, I know there were people out there that said that, oh, I couldn't watch, you know, I got 10 minutes in and I you know, I stopped watching. I'm like, oh, okay, whatever.
Yeah, it makes you wonder because I think even people like that, if they were kind of given it in a piecemeal fashion, they might have been able to chew on it a bit more. It's like, I've got this whole week to potentially take on this first episode and see how I get on with it. And, you know, on our Discord server, we were kind of tracking it week by week and seeing how well it was doing on the Netflix charts on, you know, different parts of the world. And it sustained for quite a while. Obviously, some of that's to do with the fact the name value of Resident Evil alone. But if it was a weekly thing, if Netflix did that, you'd see that kind of chatter that these shows generate for a lot longer.
Yeah. And it was also with Netflix too, especially now, release timing was also an issue. You know, it's like, oh God, when we heard how close it was, because it's like, okay, Umbrella Academy season 3 dropped. Then a week later, season 4, part 1 of Stranger Things dropped.
Yeah.
Then a 2-week window. So, well, really, Stranger Things had a 2-week window, you know, to, you know, and we dropped. Then 2 weeks after we dropped, Sandman dropped.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so it's like, and honestly, and I know Sandman is going through. They're not going through. Sandman didn't go through any of the he did in terms of review bombing or racist bullshit. I know some people had a problem with the changing of the one character from male to female, but that was another great show, man. I mean, I wasn't a huge fan of the comic, but I respect Neil Gaiman, and that was again, that was another show where my favorite episode, I think it was 5, where him and Death are talking.
Yep.
Brilliant episode. Most of that dialogue is from the comic. Like, not a word, sentence, line changed. And it's like, that just goes to show you. It's like, you know, it all does begin with the writing, with the story, with the script. You have to have a functioning, interesting, compelling story. If you don't have that, then, you know, you're and that's what I think, for right or wrong, I have to give Netflix credit and Constantine credit and Andrew credit. They tried to do that with this. They tried to give it a new story, a unique story.
Yeah.
You know, but it just didn't, you know, it didn't land, you know, the way it needed to. And I think it is a shame, because I think they were gaining steam, or they would have gained steam with season 2. You know, based on what I had seen, and based on what I was reading and what they were trying to do, bringing Chris in, and then Ada was going to be later on in the season. She was probably going to pop up somewhere around, once they got to Japan, somewhere around episode 4 or 5, I think.
I did want to ask a slightly broader question, and kind of feel free to bring it back down to the show. But I don't know if you feel this way, but VFX, particularly on Twitter and online these days, and from video game fans as well, is often, it feels like it's under the microscope more than ever, kind of in the past. You know, you look at what Marvel does, and you hear stories from Video Game Crunch and Marvel Crunch, and you know the way the pandemic has affected everything.
Yes.
And then also something else that kind of links to it. VFX is kind of in the wider conversation now. When you look at things on YouTube like VFX guys react and stuff like that,
Yeah.
which is incredibly popular and something I enjoy. Those guys can be sometimes a bit scathing, but I know they analyzed some Resident Evil as well. But I suppose my point is, do you feel like, you know, you've been in the industry for this whole time, you've been along for the journey of VFX through all its kind of iterations. Do you feel like now more than ever, things kind of live or die on the VFX, you know, and, you know, what's your kind of take on all that thing?
Yeah, I mean, they do. It's interesting because, you know, I brought up Sandman, right? I loved, casting was perfect on that show. Music great, story fantastic, acting fantastic, direction fantastic. The environments beautiful, gorgeous. You know, every time you went to, whether it was Death's World or Desires or Dreams, I'm sorry, you know, beautiful. You know, because you know, at one point Dreams was in total dilapidation because he'd been imprisoned. That was great. But what was interesting about that show is I thought the creatures just looked like Jim Henson puppets. You know, I thought they were goofy. They totally took me out of the show. And that was an example where I felt like that was a disservice because it was like, wow, everything else to me was like gorgeous. You know, the way it was, hell was interesting, you know, the way it was rendered and the way it looked and whatnot. And some of this, the effects animation stuff, the spells and stuff like that, you know, were great. You know, but then the creatures, and I'm like, whoa, and I'm like, and that can be a problem. Like up until season 4 of Stranger Things, I thought the Demogorgon was like, okay, it's serviceable.
Yeah.
But then 4 comes along and Rodeo gets involved, and Rodeo does the big moment at the end of episode 7 where they unleash it on Hopper and the other Russian prisoners, and the thing just goes through them like a knife with, you know, to butter. And it's so well done, it's so well executed, everything about it was just great.
Yeah.
I was actually off that they didn't win Book of Boba Fett 1 because there's an example right there. The problem I have with Marvel and these Star Wars shows is, you know, Marvel's just continuing like, oh, look at Phase 5 and Phase 6, and they're pumping out shows with characters no one's heard of. I'm like, what are you doing? Why is this necessary? Why can't you just pump the brakes? Can you do like 1 film a year and maybe 2 shows, you know, 1 at the top of the year and 1 at the fall, you know, that type of thing. No. They got to keep cranking this stuff out, and the effects end up suffering because the schedule is truncated. And the other problem with Marvel is Marvel as a client is indecisive as you can get. Right. Those guys will change their mind in the 11th hour, not giving a damn for anyone or anything. They just will make it. No, you know what? You know, the Avengers all have to have new uniforms when they do their space travel. So I'm like,
yeah.
The fact that Marvel gets away with putting digital clothing on people is absolute bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
It is, and that is the biggest waste of creativity and money I've ever seen. The fact that they did that in the Avengers films was just criminal in my opinion, because it's kind of like, you know what? This is where you need to, as EPs, as creatives, a director, whatever, you need to just say, this is what the costume is going to be. This is what they're going to be wearing. Manufacture it, please, wardrobe department, and be done with it. Same thing with Spider-Man. For Spider-Man to have a digital suit, that is ridiculous. And it's just, so Marvel for me, I have, honestly, guys, I mean, I just speaking for myself, I mean, I know people like Marvel films and stuff like that. I have no desire to work for them because I know how they work, and that's not the kind of visual effects I want to do. There is spectacle to some of their stuff, but I felt honestly for me,
I think what you're saying though is not a secret. Like everybody, there seems to be a wider opinion that the effects are slipping because of those schedules, and so I don't think you're kind of speaking out of turn.
no, it's just, I mean, for me, Marvel peaked at Captain America and Winter Soldier. That to me was that was the peak. In terms of story and just how you composed. I mean, that's where the Russo brothers blew up. And then for me, the Russo brothers never got back to that level of directing and filmmaking. I felt that film was on a whole nother level, and I was excited. I was like, if this is what Marvel movies are going to look like going forward, sign me up. And then we get the latest Thor movie, which I can't even go see. I went to see Spider-Man No Way Home, which everybody raved about. Everybody was, it's the greatest thing since sliced milk. And I'm like, oh my God, the humor is just so forced in these films. I can't handle it. So, and the visual effects, are just like, window dressing. And I think visual effects are being used for a lack of genuine creativity and and they're ultimately the ultimate problem solving. It's like, well, we need a set here, but we don't know what it is. Okay, well, all right, just blue screen it and we'll figure it out in post.
Yeah.
Why do you have to do that? Why can't you do a Dune? Why can't you think like that? Why can't you build sets?
Is that just because they have so much money? Do you think they don't spend the time thinking about it because they know?
I think that is, and I think I really don't know. I can't speak. I don't want to turn this into Marvel bashing. That's not what I'm trying to do. But it's just there. For me, I gravitate toward projects that I have a strong bond or connection to. That's why I went after Preacher. That's why I went after Resident Evil. That's why I'm very interested in things like the BioShock film. That's another. That's probably another one of one of my all-time favorite video games is BioShock. I'm interested in the Horizon Zero Dawn series. In God
speaking my
War,
language.
God of War at Amazon, Mass Effect at Amazon. All those are very, very. They're right up my alley. That's all those are my wheelhouse. I don't. I mean, I had a good time working on. I wasn't familiar with it, but when the show went on hiatus before we filmed anything because of COVID early on, I got to work for 6 months on Shadow and Bone. I didn't know what it was. A friend of mine needed help, and he's like, "Dude, can you help?" I'm like, "Sure, no problem." And I'm like, "Holy shit, this is really good,"
Love Shadow and Bone.
Yeah, and so they started doing season 2 while I was doing Resident Evil, so I couldn't get on that. And there's talk of them adapting Six of Crows, which I love that book. And I'm like, oh yeah, okay, if that happens, I want to be involved with that because those characters are just great. So I tend to gravitate toward content and IP like that, and that's why I went after sight unseen Resident Evil. And sometimes it's like a craps game, crapshoot, you're just rolling the dice and you're hoping that it, comes out. Case in point, like I watched it on a whim and I watched it before it blew up, but Jesus Christ, man, that Arcane show, holy shit.
Yeah. I'm trying to get everybody in First Aid Spray to watch that show. Nobody has yet. I need them to watch it.
Oh my God, you are doing yourself. It's criminal that you have not watched it. I've watched it twice.
Add it to the list.
Everything about that show is, and that one is going to go down they adapted a game that I didn't even play. I'm not into League of Legends. I didn't know Vi or Jinx, but I sat down and watched it and I binged it out of it. I was like, oh my God. The animation by the company in Paris called Fortiche is just like, they don't use any motion capture. It's all keyframe animation, but the animation in that show is like butter. It's some of the smoothest animation I've ever seen. The painterly style of it, everything, the directing, the voice acting, the music, the score, the soundtrack is just beautiful.
I'm
I can't
sold.
wait for season 2. But that had a long genesis, and that's honestly just for you guys. That's the kind of show I do want to be involved with. I want to be involved with a show that is creatively challenging, and that show was, because when they first started doing it, Fortiche was like 30 people, and they had to get up to like 300. And they had a period where they were stopped down after they did the pilot, because Riot didn't think it was coming along, and they had to hire some other people to help flesh it out. And look at them; they walked away with an Emmy just this last Saturday.
Yeah, it's won 20 awards. This show has since it's come out. 20,
and it's deserved every one.
Yeah,
it's just truly remarkable, and that's the kind of thing. And I like that because I also love Death and Robots, love that as well.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
I like those little stories and the unique way and all the varied type of animation that you see within that one. That's why that one's really unique and really cool. I can't wait for season 4 because I've loved every season. So I love that kind of stuff too. But this, it just, unfortunately, so many things have to come into place for these adaptations to succeed. A lot of it is, I don't know if it's luck or just timing, but so many things have to kind of align at the right moment, the right time, in terms of people behind it, people creating it, the creators, the EPs, the money getting infused into it. So many things have to gel at the same time before anything is even made. And then you go through the production process, and you hope that your actors are all right and spot on, and it's just, you just don't know. You don't know until it's dropped on the audience. But I think there's something to be said for trying to find a smart way to include an audience. Say, like, what would have happened if Netflix had said, "Hey, let's show like the first 2 episodes of Resident Evil to fans of the show and get their opinion on it." And I'm a big believer in that because shows like 24, which I loved, and shows like even the recent Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul shows, all changed as they were being made due to audience reaction because of social media and stuff like that. Like the whole Jesse character, there was a character that he wasn't supposed to go beyond 3 episodes. You know what I mean? It's stuff like that. It all can change for the better. I'm not saying that the audience needs to have a shareholder stake in it, but getting people's reactions to things like that early on, I think, are beneficial. Look what happened with the Sonic movie.
I was just going to say, yeah.
Great example. Yeah.
That wasn't even solicited advice. It just, they made the mistake of dumping it out there, and they horrified people, and there was such a backlash on it for good reasons. I mean, come on, you've given them a human. I mean, that was the shit of nightmares.
Who said, "Oh, we can't really criticize it. It's up to them. It's their decision," which I sort of understand. But as a VFX guy, you can appreciate that something like that goes out, and that's the reaction, and you think, "Okay, this is fair. Maybe we can look at this again."
Yeah, because like for example, my work, like with the creatures and stuff. Like if people, or even just the show, if people have, I'm all for constructive criticism. You know what I mean? If someone has a complaint or a problem or an issue with something I may have done, or oh, I like this, but I didn't like this because of this, I'm all for it. Same with the show. It's like people say I just didn't like it, and I'm like, okay, that's fine. I respect that, but why? What part of it? What didn't you like?
Yeah,
that type of thing. I'm more responsive to that rather than people just saying, "Oh, the show's dog," and then that's it. It's like, really? I mean, come on. I try when I'm also working with vendors, and sometimes as a visual effects supervisor, you'll see a first pass or something, or you'll see a shot that just does not improve. You keep getting notes. You keep giving the same note. That's even more frustrating when you give the same note on something and you don't see a change iteration after iteration. It gets very frustrating, and you have to know how to navigate that because you could drop the hammer and say, "Look, all right, we're going to take this and give it to someone else." And sometimes you do have to do that.
Yeah.
It does get to that point, but I try to what I do. I try to be positive with everything, and then try to get the best out of people, even if it's something that I don't like. It's like, okay, I appreciate that, but let's try this instead, or let's okay, that's not working. And then I have to factor in, Andrew's opinion on it, and then it goes to Constantine and their opinion on it if they weigh in, and then finally Amazon. Amazon has the final say with the visual effects of their shows.
I was just going to say, I think it's funny you exactly attached onto what the audience reaction probably would have been better off being. It's like, this isn't necessarily for me. How about we do, as you said, the mansion or whatever, rather than just screeching into the void.
Yeah.
To close this and sort of bring it home, do you have any final words for the Resident Evil community? I think specifically the people that are listening that enjoyed the show, or at least open-minded to it. We talked a lot about that negativity and that negative reaction. Just as a kind of, as we said, this is a bit of a post-mortem. We really appreciate you kind of really getting candid about this. But is there anything that you'd just like to say, to the fans of the show?
I just would like to say thanks to anybody and everybody that watched all 8 episodes, sat through them all, and then by the end, if you didn't like it, that's fine. If you loved it, hey, that's even better. But I appreciate all kinds of fans regarding the show, as long as they can explain. I even like to hear, okay, what if you really liked it? All right, tell me what part of it did you like? What did you really respond to? What resonated with you? And then if you didn't like it, if you can articulate what it was, it's good for me to hear that, because it's good to know that going forward on other works and stuff like that. So I definitely appreciate the general fandoms. I'll in tweets, I often use quotes when I refer to fans, and what I'm doing there is just referring to the gatekeepers, the people that feel staunchly that no, you can't do this to Resident Evil. You can only do this, and it's like, no, I'm sorry, if that's how it's going to be, then you're going to stagnate the IP quicker than anything. Yeah. You have to be open to some interpretation. And like I said, I think maybe hopefully we'll get to a point. I don't know what the timetable is where the title reverts back to Capcom. And then it'll be interesting. Is Capcom gonna risk it again? Is Capcom gonna give it to another film or television production company, or are they just hold on to it? Feeling that they've been burned. We didn't have much interaction with them during it. They could weigh in, and they would generally weigh in. I know they weighed in a lot on the creature design for the film, but they literally saw what we were doing and they had no feedback.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Get full T-shirt on it.
What's that?
Get full T-shirt on it. They'll sort it out.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, Kevin, we really appreciate you joining us for this conversation. This has been enlightening, certainly.
Yeah, anytime. I like speaking about the show, and I like hearing people's opinions of it, and I'm not afraid for people telling me, their harsh opinions on it. I'm fine with it. It's all a learning process, and hopefully Constantine and Netflix will learn from this experience as well. Because if they go into another licensed IP like this, whether it's Resident Evil or something else, hopefully, I think there's things here, takeaways that can be applied to bettering content down the road. Especially if we're seeing more and more video game adaptations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, all of us here, we all had mixed opinions on different parts, but, as we said at the beginning, the CGI was definitely the strongest part that we all agreed on, even though, it wasn't necessarily all amazing, but when it was amazing, it was truly amazing. And we've had multiple conversations since on our Discord community just about the spider alone and how it may well be the best CGI spider of all time. So there you go.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Well, nothing else remains for me but to thank our contributors, our patrons, and our listeners. Join the First Aid Spray Discord server to become part of our community and hear the show early and unedited. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and more. All of these links and all of our content can be found at faspraypod.com. You can listen to the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and all good podcasting apps. And if you like what you hear, please please do leave us a review where you can and spread the good word. Don't forget you can support the show by picking up some merch or at patreon.com/FA Spray Pod for as little as $1 a month. It's funny, actually, Kevin, you mentioned the S.D. Perry novels. In our next episode, we'll be covering the book that novelizes Resident Evil 3, so make sure you, if you're watching this on YouTube, hit subscribe, or wherever else you're listening to this, make sure you follow us so you can pick that episode up very, very soon. Thank you to the panel. You can follow all of us individually at Cyniac_123, James is at Moist Owlets OFF, Kelsey is at K_D_B_, and Kevin, I'm sure I'm going to butcher this probably. Kevin is at Fushi Patas, is that how we say that?
Fuchipatas, it's Spanish. It's real quick. It just translates to like stinky paws or stinky feet. It's a reference to one of my dogs.
I love it. What a wholesome end. Thank you all for listening, Kevin. Thank you for joining us, and have a good week.
So, how did the podcast go? Really? You thought I'd sacrifice my perfect record just for an interview? An exclusive interview that I couldn't make? Kevin was good? Yeah? He had a good time? Fantastic. Yeah, I love that spider. Anyway, it turns out I actually was on the podcast. I'm just the secret character. Mr. President.